Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to sift through important sources and give you the key takeaways. Today, we're tackling something quite interesting, a bit of a paradox, actually. We're looking for answers to modern anxiety in a book that's nearly 100 years old. We're talking about the philosopher Bertrand Russell and his, well, really influential 1930 book, The Conquest of Happiness. So our mission, our goal for this deep dive is unpack this pretty unassuming little paperback. It's only about 208 pages. But, despite looking quite modest, it's quietly shaped how a lot of modern writers on happiness think. People like Csikszentmihalyi, with Flow, or even Oliver Burkeman, their arguments often echo Russell. It's pretty amazing, really, for a book from that era to still feel so relevant.
It really is.
Yeah.
And Russell's own perspective when he wrote it is key. He was 58, just remarried, and this is important, coming out of a pretty long depression. So yeah, it's not your typical self-help guide. It's definitely not dry philosophy either. It's more like the work of this deeply rational thinker trying to figure out, okay, what actually works for ordinary well-being? Practical, non-mystical stuff based on his own struggles.
Yeah, you definitely feel that practical, almost down-to-earth approach.
Yeah.
So for today's deep dive, first we'll look at his pretty blunt claim that most unhappiness, it's self-inflicted, not fate. Then we'll get into his diagnosis, the causes he saw, and finally his recipe for happiness, which is honestly surprisingly simple but seems to last. It's a roadmap that, weirdly enough, still feels like it could have been written yesterday. Okay, let's unpack this. Russell kicks things off with a pretty bold statement, right? Saying most unhappiness is self-inflicted, not just bad luck. That's a strong starting point.
Yeah.
How does he build that case?
It is strong, and he spends a lot of the book on it, actually. About 2/3 is just diagnosing the causes of unhappiness, as he puts it. It's very analytical, like a doctor figuring out the illness before the cure. And his list, it includes things we all recognize: competition, boredom, fatigue, envy.
Yeah. But he also digs into deeper psychological things: fear of what people think, feeling guilty or sinful, even persecution mania, and, fear of death.
That's quite the list, covers a lot of ground, internal and external pressures. But saying most is self-inflicted. I mean, surely things like poverty or real injustice cause unhappiness that isn't exactly self-inflicted. How did he square that?
That's a fair question. And Russell wasn't really denying that external hardships exist, of course. His focus was more on our internal reaction to things and on these culturally ingrained habits that he thought make us unhappy almost regardless of circumstances. What we do in our own heads. And this is where it gets really interesting. He argues Western culture has sort of engineered two chronic anxieties: the habit of comparison and the habit of repression. Okay. Comparison and repression. And honestly, you, the listener, you'll probably recognize these immediately. Let's start with comparison. That one feels very now. What did he mean by keeping score against neighbors?
Yeah, it's painfully relevant. He basically described it as this constant mental checklist. How do I stack up against them? Scrolling social media, seeing perfect lives, or just hearing about a friend's success. That little pang of, am I behind? Russell saw that nearly a century ago. He said it breeds envy, makes you feel like you're always falling short. It's this endless race you can't win.
Oh, yeah, that resonates. And the other one, repression. Sounds pretty heavy.
It is heavy. For Russell, repression meant treating your natural impulses, your desires, as if they're somehow morally wrong or suspect. It's that feeling that you can't just be yourself because parts of you aren't acceptable, maybe according to society, or even your own internal critic, leads to massive guilt, he thought, and this feeling of being divided, like you're hiding parts of yourself.
Right. But the crucial thing Russell says is that both these habits, comparison, repression, they're learned. They're not innate. So if they're learned, they can be unlearned. Yeah. That's the implication, right? Yeah. Which leads to the question, what's the antidote then?
Exactly. That's the hopeful part. If it's learned, we have some agency. We're not just stuck with it. And yeah, he definitely starts offering practical ways to kind of chip away at these habits.
He gets surprisingly specific, too. Like his chapter on fatigue, I found that really striking. What was the distinction he made there? Why was that important for anxiety?
That chapter is brilliant. He draws this line between muscular fatigue, genuine physical tiredness after hard work, and nervous fatigue, which he argues is way, way more draining. Nervous fatigue is that mental exhaustion, endless worrying, replaying things in your head, rumination. Your mind just won't switch off. And crucially, he says, just resting your body doesn't cure that kind of fatigue.
I totally get that nervous fatigue. Sometimes I find myself just like replaying a conversation for hours. It's exhausting. And his idea of mind wandering as a cure, not just forcing yourself to relax, That feels quite liberating. Did that strike you too?
Absolutely. His fix for nervous fatigue wasn't just rest more, it was switch your attention. He literally prescribed taking time for deliberate mind wandering, like an early version of mindfulness maybe, but without the formal structure. Just letting your mind drift, focusing on something else entirely to break those anxious thought loops, consciously shifting focus.
And a lot of that nervous fatigue comes from inside. But Russell definitely saw external pressures feeding into it too, right? His stuff on fear of public opinion. It's almost spooky how much it sounds like today, 90 years before social media. What was his take there?
It's uncanny, isn't it? He had this famous line, "The modern man is haunted not by what his village thinks of him, but by what an imagined audience of millions might think."
I mean, just think about online life now. One wrong tweet, one bad photo, global judgment. His solutions back then, geographic and intellectual mobility. Basically, move somewhere else if your local scene is stifling. And, just as vital, read widely. Get different perspectives so local opinions or taboos lose their power. Gain perspective, escape the crowd mentality.
Okay, so he's diagnosed all these causes. Comparison, repression, that draining nervous fatigue, fear of what people think. So what's the flip side? How do we actually find happiness, according to Russell? He shifts gears in the last third of the book, right? To the causes of happiness.
Yeah.
And his answer is almost, well, embarrassingly simple.
It really is refreshingly simple, no complex theories. It boils down to this core idea of outward-directed energy. He calls it zest, and you can think of it almost like, well, like flow, that concept we talk about now. You know, that state where you're so absorbed in doing something that you completely lose track of time, forget yourself. Right. He has that wonderful image. A man absorbed in repairing a boat or a woman absorbed in cultivating a garden forgets to ask whether they are happy. Happiness is the byproduct of losing self-consciousness in something larger. That's such a powerful idea. Happiness isn't the goal you aim for directly.
Exactly. It sneaks up on you while you're engaged in something else. It's an outcome, not an object of scrutiny. And work is important in his view, but maybe not how we usually think about it.
Yeah, it's not about climbing the ladder or making bank. For him, work matters if it gives you two things: using your skills and seeing that your work is useful. Right.
Spot on. And his example for that is just fantastic. A bricklayer who sees a wall rise under his trowel is happier than a bored stockbroker counting zeros. It just perfectly captures that need for tangible results, for feeling like you've actually made something or contributed something real, seeing the outcome of your effort. That provides a kind of deep, quiet satisfaction that maybe, abstract or detached work often lacks. Many people feel that disconnect today.
A bored stockbroker counting zeros. That image really sticks, doesn't it? It cuts right through the usual status symbols. And he talks about affection, too, but again, in a very grounded way, not like some grand romance novel.
Right. For Russell, affection wasn't about high drama. It was more like the steady, quiet habit of actually being interested in another person's life, their existence. It's about genuine curiosity and care, that simple connection.
So if you had to boil down Russell's recipe for happiness into just a few key points, what would they be?
It's pretty straightforward, really. Cultivate skills, find interests that absorb you, nurture affection for others, and crucially, stop judging your own natural instincts so harshly. It's all about building a life that looks outwards, engages with the world, instead of just constantly navel-gazing.
And he even ends with this surprisingly ecological touch, doesn't he?
Yeah.
In the final chapter on the happy man, it feels almost meditative.
It really does. He suggests one of the simplest, most reliable ways to lift your mood is just to stand under a tree and consciously notice things. The leaves moving, the clouds changing, the birds. To let the cosmos talk while you merely listen, as he put it. It's this beautiful instruction to just reconnect, shift focus from all the internal chatter to the actual physical world around you.
It's really fascinating how the book landed when it first came out, compared to how it's viewed now. You'd almost expect a 1930 book to be forgotten.
It says a lot about its core wisdom, I think. Back in 1930, reviews praised its clarity, but some dismissed it as, well, too commonsensical to be serious philosophy. The Times Literary Supplement called it a middle-aged man's apology for contentment. Kind of faint praise, right? But it did capture that practical, undramatic tone. He wasn't aiming for some earth-shattering new theory, just something genuinely useful.
But then it just sort of stuck around, became this quiet classic. And you see it pop up in surprising places, like Paul McCartney apparently carried it on tour in '66. John Gardner, who was the U.S. Cabinet Secretary, assigned it to White House Fellows in the '70s. And then, get this, in 2012, a Japanese psychiatrist, Dr. Takeshi Kato, made a manga version that sold 300,000 copies. Clearly, it resonated way beyond academia.
The reach is incredible, and it loops back into modern research, too. You see positive psychology journals now regularly citing Russell's idea of zest as basically a forerunner to Csikszentmihalyi's flow and Seligman's ideas about engagement. So what seemed just common sense back then turns out to be pretty foundational for how we now understand well-being. His observations had real legs.
Now, obviously, it's a book from 1930. It's not perfect by today's standards. People point out, fairly, that Russell maybe downplays things like systemic injustice. And yeah, some examples feel dated, the class assumptions, the very heteronormative context. Those are valid criticisms, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely valid. It's crucial to read it with that historical context in mind. But what's interesting is even critics acknowledge the core message holds up. Feminist philosopher Kate Mann, for example, points out the limitations, but says Russell's core advice that outward gaze is still incredibly useful, even for people facing really difficult, unjust situations. The idea is that focusing outward can build resilience and meaning, regardless of the external constraints. The core wisdom seems to transcend the context.
Yeah. And that core takeaway feels so relevant right now, especially when, it's so easy to get sucked into doom scrolling or just endlessly replaying arguments in your head. There was this great line in one of our sources, like an analogy. When you catch yourself doing that, it's like Russell's whispering, "You are treating your mind like a bad neighborhood. Take it for a walk in a wider world." I love that. It's such a practical invitation to just shift your focus.
It's a perfect summary, and Russell's own final line in the book says it all, really. The happy man is the man who lives objectively, whose interests are directed outwards to the rhythms of earth and sky rather than to the prison of self. Just beautifully brings his whole argument together.
So wrapping up our deep dive on Bertrand Russell's The Conquest of Happiness, the big message isn't about chasing happiness directly, trying to grab it. It's more about creating the conditions for it, living in an engaged, outward-looking way so that happiness can just show up as a natural result. Not finding happiness, but living happily.
Exactly. Which leaves you, the listener, with maybe a final thought to chew on, building on Russell. If you want to feel better, maybe the best thing you can do is stop examining your own feelings so closely and start examining the world just outside your own skin. What piece of that wider world will you choose to really engage with today?